The street looked perfect at first glance, like something taken out of a real estate magazine. Manicured lawns stretched evenly across property lines, trimmed hedges stood sharp and neat, and houses carried that uniform charm that made the whole neighborhood look like it was cut from the same pattern. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and fertilizer, a sign that appearances here mattered more than comfort. It was the kind of place where people waved politely when passing each other, but their eyes lingered long enough to measure, to judge, to compare. Behind the smiles, there was something rigid, something that hinted not everyone felt free on this street. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but it was there, like a quiet pressure in the air. In the evenings, the silence was almost unsettling. Children rode bikes, but only within certain limits. Dogs barked, but only briefly before their owners hushed them. Neighbors walked with straight postures, nodding at each other with forced warmth, as if anything less might stir suspicion. Everyone knew who kept the rules and who didn't. That knowledge carried weight here. It was the type of neighborhood where stepping out of line wasn't just frowned upon. It was remembered, whispered about, stored away like ammunition for the right moment. At the center of this carefully controlled world was the Homeowners Association. The HOA wasn't just about collecting fees or maintaining the community pool. It was a shadow power, the kind that held more influence than outsiders might think. The board wasn't elected by chance. Those who sat in its chairs were the ones with the loudest voices, the sharpest tongues, and the deepest hunger to be in control. And within that group, one person stood taller, or rather, leaned harder than the rest. She wasn't tall in stature, but her presence filled a room, her tone cut through walls, and her rules carried the weight of law. To the rest of the neighborhood, she was both feared and tolerated, a queen of clipped hedges and violation notices. People had a name for her behind closed doors: Karen. Karen's house looked like it belonged to her role, spotless, rigidly kept, as though even the blinds followed strict orders. She had the kind of eyes that scanned for flaws faster than anyone could hide them. A trash can left on the curb an hour too long, grass grown half an inch higher than acceptable, or a car parked slightly off-center. Nothing escaped her. It wasn't about community pride. It was about dominance, about reminding everyone that she saw everything and that her word in this tiny kingdom of fences and driveways was final. For a long time, most people bowed to her will, some out of fear, some out of exhaustion. They paid their dues, adjusted their flower beds, and avoided her gaze. But new families didn't always understand the unspoken rules. They moved in thinking they had found a peaceful neighborhood, not realizing they had stepped into a place where freedom was traded for order. The latest newcomer had no idea how much that would cost. She was young, confident, and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen real battles, though no one in the Navy, or who knew that yet. To the casual observer, she was just another homeowner moving into a nice house, unloading boxes, planting her roots. She was polite but not overly friendly, private but not unfriendly. She smiled when spoken to, but she didn't offer much beyond that. It wasn't arrogance, it was simply who she was. Independent, steady, the kind of person who didn't bend easily. And it didn't take long for Karen to notice. The first encounter seemed harmless enough. Karen appeared on the driveway with her clipboard, explaining in her usual clipped tone the benefits of joining the HOA. The young woman listened politely, nodded at the right moments, but when Karen finally reached the part about mandatory fees and community expectations, she shook her head. Calmly, without apology, she said she wouldn't be joining. Her house wasn't bound by HOA rules, she explained. The contract she signed gave her the choice, and she was exercising it. It was said plainly, without malice, without confrontation. But to Karen, it was the beginning of war. From that moment, the air shifted. What had once been just a quiet neighborhood with polite waves now carried a sharp tension every time the two crossed paths. Karen, used to being obeyed without question, wasn't accustomed to hearing no. And this no wasn't just resistance. It was public defiance, If one person refused her authority, what stopped others from doing the same? To her, it wasn't about a single homeowner. It was about control, and she wasn't about to lose it. Neighbors began to notice the subtle shift. Karen lingered longer outside the young woman's house, scanning the yard for any mistakes she could use as leverage. Conversations carried a sharper edge when Karen's name was mentioned, though always in whispers. Some felt sympathy for the newcomer. Others felt relief that someone else was finally standing up to the cell, if appointed queen. But beneath it all was fear. Fear that this conflict wouldn't stay quiet. Fear that Karen, with her iron grip on the community, wouldn't let this go. At night, the neighborhood lights glowed soft and steady, but under the calm surface, something darker stirred. The balance of power was shifting, and it wasn't going to happen without a fight. It started with little things that most people wouldn't notice, but in a neighborhood like this, where order was everything, they stood out like cracks in polished glass. Karen began her campaign with the simplest weapon she had: complaints. One morning, the young woman found a notice tucked under her windshield wiper. It wasn't official, not from the city or the county, but written on HOA letterhead and signed by Karen herself. It accused her of leaving her trash bin out overnight, even though she hadn't. Another week she was warned about her lawn, even though it was freshly mowed. At first she ignored it. She had bigger things on her mind: her work, her peace, her desire to carve out a quiet life. But ignoring Karen was like pouring gasoline on a fire. Karen thrived on confrontation. She didn't need to win with logic. She won with persistence, with the kind of pressure that wore people down until they gave in just to breathe easier. But this time, her tactics weren't working. The young woman didn't bend, didn't argue, didn't even look rattled. She simply carried on as though the notices didn't exist. That resistance, the calm, almost dismissive strength, cut at Karen more deeply than any loud argument could have. Behind closed doors, Karen's world was far less controlled than she made it seem. Her marriage had worn thin years ago, her husband spending more time on late-night drives than in their living room. Her adult son had distanced himself from her constant need for control, rarely visiting unless forced. The HOA was all she had left, a kingdom where her word still meant something. Losing grip on even one house felt like losing her entire identity. That gnawed at her, in ways she didn't admit, not even to herself. Meanwhile, the young woman had her own weight to carry, though no one in the neighborhood knew it. To them, she was just private, maybe aloof, but the truth was far more complicated. She wasn't just another homeowner, she was law enforcement. A sheriff, no less, though she kept that part quiet. In her line of work, blending into the background was sometimes safer than announcing authority. She wanted her home to be a place where she could rest without the badge defining her. But it also meant she couldn't be intimidated by someone like Karen. She had faced worse. She had stared down real danger. Compared to that, HOA harassment was little more than noise. Still, she knew that noise could become dangerous if left unchecked. The standoff deepened when Karen began pulling neighbors into her web. At block parties, she whispered about the outsider who refused to join, painting the young woman as selfish, careless, and unwilling to contribute to the neighborhood. Some neighbors, eager to stay in Karen's good graces, nodded along, repeating the story to others. Rumors spread quickly. Soon, people the young woman had never spoken to gave her cold looks, muttering about how unfair it was that she got to enjoy the neighborhood without paying dues. The tension stretched beyond Karen herself, reaching into every corner of the street. But there were others, quiet supporters who admired her strength, who envied her refusal to bow down. They didn't dare speak up, not openly, but they noticed. One older couple began waving at her with genuine warmth. A single father down the street offered to help her carry groceries. Small gestures, but ones that told her she wasn't alone, even if most people stayed silent. Still, she could feel the divide forming around her like a crack in glass. One side loyal to Karen, the other quietly rooting for resistance. The incidents grew bolder. Karen reported her to the county about supposed unauthorized renovations when she repainted her front porch. Inspectors showed up, wasting hours of her time before admitting everything was legal. Another day, her mailbox was dented, as if struck deliberately. No one saw who did it, but she had her suspicions. Each act was small, almost petty, but together they painted a picture of harassment escalating, step by step. The young woman, for all her strength, wasn't immune. At night, lying in bed, she felt the weight of it pressing down. She had faced criminals, yes, but this was different. This was inside her home, her supposed safe space. The one place where she wanted peace now carried tension in every creak of the floorboards. She thought of calling it out, pressing charges, but a part of her held back. She wasn't just a woman being harassed. She was the sheriff. Admitting the situation meant exposing her identity, and she wasn't ready for that. She wanted to handle it like anyone else would, without the badge overshadowing everything. That choice, noble as it was, left her vulnerable in ways she hadn't expected. Karen, meanwhile, became consumed. What began as irritation morphed into obsession. She watched the young woman constantly, noting the times she came and went, the guests who visited, even the groceries she carried inside. She filled her evenings with long, ranting phone calls to other HOA members, railing about how one house could ruin the whole community. But beneath the words was something darker, a fear of losing control, a desperation to prove she still mattered. The more the young woman resisted, the more Karen's pride unraveled. Financial stress added to the fuel. Karen's husband, quiet and weary, had hinted at cutting back on expenses. Their savings weren't as strong as they once were. If she lost her grip on the HOA, she lost the little security she had left. In her mind, the young woman wasn't just a neighbor. She was a threat to her survival, her image, her sense of worth. That twisted need for power grew into something dangerous, something that reached beyond notices and rumors. The turning point came during a summer afternoon when the young woman's daughter, a teenager full of quiet confidence like her mother, was seen sitting on the porch with a friend. They were laughing, sharing snacks, living the kind of simple moment kids should have. Karen stopped in front of the house, her eyes narrowing as though the sight itself offended her. She made some comment about noise levels, about appropriate behavior for this neighborhood. The teenager, tired of the constant tension, spoke back, firmly, respectfully, but clearly. And just like that, the conflict wasn't only between Karen and the sheriff. It had spilled onto the next generation. The neighbors felt it too. The air was thicker now, as if every interaction carried the weight of an approaching storm. Conversations in driveways stopped abruptly when one of them walked by. Mailboxes became places for exchanging whispers. Some swore they heard Karen shouting late at night, her voice carrying across the still streets. Others noticed the sheriff's daughter walking a little faster, glancing over her shoulder. Karen's world was spiraling, but she couldn't see it. To her, this was still a battle she could win, if only she pushed harder, louder, stronger. But obsession has a way of clouding judgment. And as her control slipped further from her grasp, her methods turned darker, edged with desperation. What began as notes and gossip was on its way to becoming something far more dangerous. The neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when all that silent pressure, all those whispered threats, would explode. The night it happened was thick with heat, the kind of summer air that clung to skin and made even silence feel heavy. The neighborhood looked still on the surface, sprinklers ticking in the distance, porch lights casting warm halos across trimmed lawns. But underneath, there was a current, a hum of tension that had been building for months. Windows glowed faintly, curtains drawn, neighbors tucked inside their houses. But some of them, restless and curious, kept watch from behind those curtains. Everyone knew something was coming. No one could say exactly what, but the air was too charged for it to end quietly. The sheriff's daughter had been outside on the porch again, a book in her lap, headphones tucked in her ears. The faint glow from the living room light behind her framed her in a soft outline, a teenager lost in her own world. She wasn't thinking of Karen, not at that moment. She was just breathing in the evening, trying to enjoy what at peace. She could find in a place where peace rarely lasted long. Her mother, exhausted from another day of work, was inside making tea. She had told her daughter to come in soon, not to linger too late. But she hadn't forced it. For once, she wanted her daughter to feel a little normal, a little free. Karen had been pacing her own kitchen, her fingers drumming on the counter, her thoughts spiraling. She'd seen the girl outside again, sitting there as though mocking her authority. In her mind, it wasn't just a girl on a porch. It was defiance. It was disrespect. It was proof that she had lost her grip. And with each step she took back and forth, with each glass of wine she drained faster than the last, her anger grew sharper. She told herself she was only going to confront them, to finally force them into submission. But the truth was already darker than she could admit. She grabbed the gun from the drawer, a weapon her husband had bought years earlier, meant for protection, though it had never been used. Her hands shook as she held it, not from fear, but from a twisted sense of righteousness. She muttered under her breath about rules, about order, about people who thought they were above the community. Her reflection in the window showed wild eyes, tight lips. She didn't look like the queen of the HOA anymore. She looked like someone cornered, desperate, ready to strike. The sound of her footsteps on the driveway broke the quiet. The sheriff's daughter looked up, sliding her headphones off, confusion flashing across her face. Karen's silhouette was sharp against the streetlights, her arms stiff at her side. The girl rose slowly, sensing something was wrong. She wasn't afraid at first. Karen was loud. Karen was dramatic. But Karen wasn't supposed to be dangerous. But then the gun lifted. The moment stretched into something unbearable, every sound amplified. The buzzing of insects, the faint whistle of the wind, the catch of the girl's breath. Her voice trembled when she spoke, though she tried to keep it steady. "You don't need to do this." Her hands lifted, palms open, the universal gesture of peace. Inside the house, her mother froze, hearing the sharp crack of a voice outside that didn't sound like conversation. She rushed to the door, already reaching for the weapon holstered in the drawer near the entryway. Karen's thoughts were chaotic, colliding with each other, but underneath was a single pounding truth. She needed to win. For months, she had been losing, slipping further from the control that defined her. Here, now, she could take it back. She could prove that she still ruled, that no one defied her without paying. But even as she thought it, there was something frantic in her chest, something that didn't quite feel like power, but like drowning. The sheriff burst through the front door just as Karen's finger tightened on the trigger. The crack of the gunshot shattered the night, echoing down the neat little street. The daughter stumbled back, the bullet whistling past her shoulder, close enough to burn the air by her ear. She screamed, the sound ripping through the quiet like glass breaking. Neighbors pulled back their curtains, some gasped, some ducked, and no one stepped outside. The sheriff raised her own gun in one swift, instinctive motion, her body moving faster than her mind could catch up. The sight of her daughter standing there, wide-eyed, trembling, with a gun pointed at her, it set something primal alight inside her. "Drop it!" she shouted, her voice cutting, authoritative, laced with a fury only a mother could carry. For a split second, Karen hesitated. Her arm wavered, her breath came ragged. She wasn't in control anymore. She wasn't the queen of the HOA. She wasn't the enforcer of order. She was just a woman with a shaking hand and a choice. Her eyes flicked from the daughter to the sheriff, and in them was something raw, something almost pleading. But then pride took over. Pride The very thing that had driven her this far. The very thing that had hollowed her out. She steadied her grip. The sheriff didn't wait. Training took over. Another shot rang out louder, sharper, and this time the scream came from Karen. She collapsed to the ground, the gun clattering uselessly beside her. The daughter rushed back into the house, her sobs mixing with the ringing in her ears. The sheriff advanced slowly, her weapon still trained, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would break her ribs. Karen writhed on the pavement, clutching her side, blood pooling dark against the concrete. Her breaths came in gasps, each one heavier than the last. She looked up at the sheriff, eyes wide, not with hate, but with something hollow. For the first time she seemed small, fragile, stripped of all the power she had built around herself. I just wanted order, she whispered, her voice faint, broken. The sheriff's hand trembled, though she didn't lower her weapon until she was sure Karen couldn't move. Her mind raced, not just with the weight of what she had done, but with the image of her daughter standing there moments away from death. Her chest burned with rage, relief, and horror all tangled into one. She shouted for her daughter, her voice cracking, and when the girl appeared in the doorway, her face streaked with tears, the sheriff's knees nearly buckled. The aftermath unfolded in chaos. Neighbors emerged, some filming with shaky hands, others calling emergency services. Red and blue lights soon painted the pristine street, sirens slicing through the night. Officers rushed in, some recognizing her instantly, their eyes wide at the sight of their own sheriff standing armed over a bleeding woman. They surrounded Karen, pressing gauze against her wound, while others guided the sheriff and her daughter back inside, trying to calm the storm of emotions breaking loose. Inside, the sheriff held her daughter close, her hand pressed firmly against the back of her head as, though she could shield her from everything, even memory. The girl's sobs quieted into trembling breaths, but the fear in her eyes lingered. The sheriff knew this moment would never leave her. That sound, that gun, that narrow escape. Outside, Karen's cries turned into silence as paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher. She wasn't dead, but the damage was severe. The neighborhood, once so focused on hedges and fences, now stood in stunned silence, staring at the cracks in their perfect little world. The Queen of Rules had fallen, undone not by outsiders, but by the very obsession that defined her. The sheriff stood in her doorway, her arm wrapped around her daughter, her face pale but unbroken. She had saved her child, but the weight of it settled heavily on her shoulders. The line between law and survival had blurred in an instant, and she knew the echoes of this night would follow them forever. The street did not feel the same after that night. The perfection that once defined it had been shattered, replaced with the raw memory of flashing lights, shouts, and the echo of gunfire that would not leave people's minds. For days, the neighborhood seemed paralyzed, as though no one wanted to be the first to step outside, mow their lawn, or walk their dog. The image of Karen bleeding on the pavement was burned into their thoughts, a reminder that beneath the manicured beauty of their world, something violent and unpredictable had always been simmering. For the sheriff, the hours immediately after the shooting blurred together. She sat at her kitchen table with her daughter, both of them wrapped in shock, answering the same questions from different officers over and over again. Her training told her what to say, how to report the sequence of events, and how to frame it clearly. But her heart made every word heavier, especially when her daughter clung to her arm, unwilling to let go. She had faced suspects with weapons before, but never with her own child standing in the line of fire. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the gun aimed at her daughter's chest, and her stomach twisted as though she had failed, even though she had saved her. Karen was taken to the hospital under guard, her condition critical but stable. The news spread quickly, first whispered between neighbors, then spilling into local headlines. HOA president shot after confrontation with sheriff, the stories read. The irony was too sharp for anyone to ignore. The woman who had ruled the neighborhood with notices and fines had been brought down not by a stranger, but by the very authority she had tried to undermine. Some people felt sympathy for her, pointing out her injuries, her fragile state. Others admitted, though quietly, that they felt a strange sense of justice. She had pushed too far, and it had caught up with her. Her husband didn't make public statements. He remained hidden, his face pale whenever he appeared at the hospital. Neighbors who caught glimpses of him said he looked like a man already broken long before this night. He didn't defend his wife, but he didn't condemn her either. His silence became its own story, an unspoken acknowledgement that Karen's obsession had consumed more than just the neighborhood. It had eaten away at her family, too. The sheriff faced her own storm. Though she was cleared legally within days, her use of fenici, or deemed justified. There was no escaping the weight of public eyes. Reporters camped outside the precinct, asking how it felt to shoot a neighbor, how she balanced her roles as mother and law enforcer. She answered carefully, measured, leaning on her training. But privately she struggled. The badge had never felt heavier. Saving her daughter had been instinct, but it also reminded her of the price she paid in this job, that even home was not safe, that violence could creep into the very spaces she tried to keep untouched. Her daughter bore her own scars. She stopped sitting on the porch. She jumped at the sound of loud voices or car doors slamming. The night replayed in her mind in flashes, the gleam of the gun, the sharp crack of the shot, the rush of her mother's body shielding her. She didn't want to talk about it at school, didn't want to see the pity in her classmates' eyes. At home, she kept close to her mother, her laughter quieter now, her movements more careful. The innocence she once carried had been cracked, and though time might mend it, the fracture would always remain. The community, once bound together by rules and appearances, now carried fractures of its own. Some rallied around the sheriff, offering casseroles, cards, and awkward words of support. Others whispered blame, saying she should have de-escalated, that maybe she had been too quick to pull the trigger. The divide between those loyal to Karen and those relieved by her downfall grew wider, until every wave, every nod across the street carried an edge of suspicion. The neighborhood's carefully polished unity was gone, replaced by quiet camps of loyalty and resentment. Karen, even as she recovered, clung to denial. In interviews with police at the hospital, she painted herself as the victim, claiming she had only meant to scare the girl, that the gun was never truly intended to fire. But the evidence was clear, and so were the witnesses. Neighbors admitted hearing her rant for weeks, seeing her linger outside the sheriff's house, watching her obsession build. Still, she clung to her narrative, as though admitting the truth would mean admitting her entire life had been built on a lie. Her name spread across local and even national news, not as the neighborhood enforcer she had once been proud to be, but as the symbol of how power twisted into obsession could ruin a person. HOA leaders in other cities found themselves scrutinized, their authority questioned, their motives doubted. The Karen case, as the media dubbed it, became shorthand for every story of control gone too far. For the sheriff, the public attention was suffocating. She hadn't wanted her neighbors to know her role, hadn't wanted her personal life to bleed into her badge. Now it was unavoidable. Some treated her with awe, calling her a hero for protecting her child. Others muttered that law enforcement always protected its own, that if she hadn't been sheriff, the outcome might have been different. She learned to live with the whispers, but inside she carried the heavier truth, that no one could ever understand the split-second decision she had made, the way her heart had nearly broken before her finger even pulled the trigger. The daughter tried to heal in quieter ways. Therapy sessions, long drives with her mother, and slow attempts to reclaim the feeling of safety in her own home. There were setbacks, nights of nightmares, mornings of tears. But there were also small victories. Sitting outside again, even just for 5 minutes. Smiling at her friends at school without feeling watched. Holding her mother's hand without needing to grip it so tightly. Healing didn't mean forgetting, but it meant surviving. The neighborhood itself became a shadow of what it once was. The trimmed lawns remained, the houses stayed polished, but something had been lost that no amount of landscaping could fix. Neighbors avoided eye contact more than they sought it. Conversations were clipped, cautious. No one wanted to speak too loudly, afraid of stirring ghosts that still lingered on the pavement where the blood had once pooled. The illusion of perfection was broken, and everyone knew it. Karen, stripped of her position, faced charges of assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and harassment. Court dates loomed, her reputation shattered beyond repair. The woman who once ruled with fear now sat in a hospital gown, waiting for trial, her legacy nothing more than a cautionary tale. She still spoke of control, of order, but her words rang hollow. The world had seen behind the mask, and there was no way to put it back on. The sheriff returned to work eventually, though the weight of that night never left her. Colleagues greeted her with respect, but also with careful eyes, as though unsure how to treat someone who had lived both sides of the badge so violently. She carried herself with composure, but in quiet moments, late at night, staring at her daughter's closed bedroom door, she let the cracks show. She wondered if her daughter would ever feel truly safe again. She wondered if she herself ever would. The aftermath was not a clean ending. It was jagged, messy, filled with wounds that healed unevenly. It left scars on a family, a neighborhood, a community that once believed itself untouchable. And it served as a brutal reminder that control, when fueled by pride and fear, can turn even a quiet street into a battlefield. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed. Neighbors who once traded gossip across fences now sat in pews of polished wood, their eyes fixed on the woman who had ruled them for years. Karen looked smaller than they remembered, her sharp edges dulled by the weight of reality. The confident posture she carried during HOA meetings was gone, replaced with a weary slump, as though she herself barely believed she had ended up here. The charges against her, assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, harassment, were read aloud, each one echoing through the room like another brick laid on her shoulders. Her defense tried to argue she hadn't meant to harm anyone, that the gun was meant to scare, not kill. But intent didn't erase the bullet, the screams, or the terror carved into the sheriff's daughter's memory. Witnesses lined up to testify, not just about the night of the shooting, but about the months leading up to it. Neighbors spoke of the notices, the harassment, the slow unraveling of Karen's obsession. One by one, they painted the picture of a woman witty. O had let power twist her until she no longer recognized the line between order and tyranny. The sheriff took the stand with composure, though inside her chest tightened with every word. She described the moment she saw the gun aimed at her daughter, the split-second choice she made to pull the trigger. Her voice did not waver, but when she looked toward her child sitting in the back of the courtroom, her eyes softened, filled with something deeper than the badge she wore. It wasn't just testimony. It was the truth of a mother who had been forced to do the unthinkable to protect her child. In the end, the jury found Karen guilty. Her sentence was not long enough to satisfy everyone. Some thought she deserved more. Others thought her age and injuries made prison unnecessary. But it was clear that her days of ruling the neighborhood were over. Stripped of her title, her power, and her reputation, she left the courthouse not as the queen of order, but as a cautionary tale. For the sheriff and her daughter, the verdict brought a kind of closure, though not the kind that erased scars. They returned home to the same house, the same porch, the same street. But it no longer felt the same. The daughter slowly began reclaiming pieces of her life, sitting outside again, going to school without the same heaviness in her chest. But she never forgot the barrel of the gun pointed at her, and she never stopped jumping at sudden noises. Some fears don't disappear. They just quiet over time. The sheriff herself carried a different burden. She had saved her daughter, yes, but she had also taken a life, not physically but symbolically. She had destroyed the identity of a woman who had once believed herself untouchable. In quiet moments, she thought about Karen, not with pity, but with a kind of sorrow. It was a tragedy, really, that someone could let pride and control consume them until they lost sight of everything else. Karen had been her own undoing long before the bullet was fired. The neighborhood bore the deepest shift. What once looked like a postcard of suburban perfection now carried shadows that no landscaping could hide. People spoke more carefully, less eager to judge or meddle. Some moved away, unwilling to live in a place where the memory of gunfire clung to the sidewalks. Others stayed, but with changed hearts. They waved at each other with less suspicion, aware now of how quickly small grievances could spiral into something dangerous. The HOA itself crumbled, its reputation beyond repair. For the first time, the street existed without the constant weight of someone policing every detail. And strangely enough, the grass still grew, the houses still stood, and the world didn't fall apart without Karen's hand controlling it. The case drew wider attention, sparking debates far beyond the neighborhood. News outlets dissected the story. Talk shows spun it into lessons about power, control, and the dangers of unchecked authority. People who had never cared about HOAs before suddenly saw them as symbols of something larger. How easily a position of small power can feed obsession. How pride can twist into cruelty. How communities can become prisons under the wrong kind of leadership. It wasn't just about one woman, one street, or one crime. It was about human nature itself, the way fear, pride, and control can eat away at the strongest facades until all that remains is ruin. Some argued justice had been served. Others pointed out that justice in cases like this is never clean. A mother and daughter would live with trauma long after the sentence was served. A woman had lost everything she had built, even if what she had built was flawed from the start. A neighborhood lost its illusion of perfection. There were no true winners, only survivors. Yet in its aftermath, the story revealed something important. It showed how fragile order is when built on fear, how dangerous pride becomes when left unchecked, and how strength doesn't always mean control. It can also mean restraint, compassion, and knowing when to step back. Karen had chased power until it destroyed her. The sheriff had carried power, but chose to wield it only when life itself hung in the balance. That difference defined the line between tyranny and justice. In the end, the story of this neighborhood wasn't about lawns, dues, or property lines. It was about people. Flawed, proud, vulnerable people who became trapped in a cycle of control and defiance until violence broke through. It was about how easily human behavior can spiral when fear of losing power becomes stronger than love, empathy, or reason. For the sheriff and her daughter, life moved forward, though forever changed. They rebuilt their quiet routines, not with the illusion of safety, but with the resilience born of surviving the worst. They held tighter to each other, spoke more openly, and cherished the small moments that once felt ordinary. And in that, there was a kind of justice too, not in courtrooms or headlines, but in the way love survived, even when everything else broke apart. The neighborhood, stripped of its queen, learned a harder truth, that rules and appearances mean nothing without humanity, and that the desire to control can become its own form of destruction. It was a lesson written not in bylaws or HOA letters, but in blood and fear on a summer night that no one would ever forget.